Hey everybody, what's up? I am Chris Runge with Runge Cars, and this is the Runge Veleno. It started as a 2004 Dodge Viper SRT10 Roadster, and as you can see has been transformed drastically with custom aluminum bodied coachwork. Modifications have been made mechanically to the exhaust, the suspension, and also to the underpinnings to allow this body to be fit to what you see here.
This video is broken up into sections so you can jump ahead to whatever part of the build that interests you. To understand my approach to this design, it's important to understand just where the Chrysler executive team was coming from when they greenlighted the Viper project. In 1988, then Chrysler head of design Tom Gale and President Robert Lutz had a vision. The idea was to capture the spirit of the great 1960s sports racers like the Shelby Cobra in a more modern package while maintaining what many consider raw mechanical underpinnings. Since Chrysler owned Lamborghini at the time, it only made sense to bring them in to assist with the design work. The Chrysler team was set on having a V10 to power the car and finally decided to take cues from their own existing iron block 8-liter used in their trucks. They redesigned this engine and cast the block in aluminum to create a reliable, lightweight monster. So why did I choose the Viper? In 2018, a client reached out to me asking if I would consider rebodying a more modern drivetrain like the C5 Corvette. Initially, I wasn't thrilled with this idea. It would be a departure from what Runge Cars was founded on. But I recalled a great book I read in 2012 titled European Style with American Muscle by Mike Gillette. The book covers the great European coach builders and low-volume automakers of the 60s and 70s who used American powertrains to create exquisite rolling art. Some of these would include Bizzarini, Izzo Grifo, Allard, De Tomaso, AC Cobra, and many more. Even the Chevy Corvette was sent to the Italian coach house Scaglietti in 1959 to receive what I believe is the most beautiful Corvette body ever. With all this rich history, I was in. However, upon researching the Corvette's underpinnings and their physical extremities, I quickly realized it would be difficult to fit the bodywork design I had in mind. With the Corvette, I would have to do some extensive modifications into critical mechanical and structural areas of the car, and very little with the Viper. My customer was on board. We decided that the Viper should be a roadster and landed on the 3rd gen model as it had limited electronic gizmos and fit the scale of my vision well. It wasn't long and we were able to source a 2004 Viper with 4,000 miles to build on. Using a lighted drawing surface, I would sketch my body design with tracing paper over these prints. The goal of the build would be to create a 1960s GT coupe that would aesthetically pay honor to the great designs of the era, yet be unique all on its own. Once my customer and I landed on what was a rough sketch, we sent the design over to my friend Alberto Hernandez to have it illustrated. These sketches and illustrations act as a guide for me during my build process. With the Viper arriving to my shop, we immediately stripped it down, removing every exterior and interior component to really get a live view of what I had to work with. It certainly wasn't going to be easy to execute this vision, but the Viper is a fantastic platform for something like this, and the pros far outweighed the visible cons. We then installed stainless headers and a full-flow CAT system, along with KW coilover fully adjustable suspension. With the Viper now stripped, I can get a better perspective of what I have to work with and around. If you guys watch my older videos, you know I've taken an old-school approach to my work in regard to computers and scanning. After having numerous people within the YouTube audience comment on how much more efficient scanning would be, I decided to have the underpinnings digitized in hopes it would expedite the overall design process. At the same time, I hired a designer out of the UK who would take my concept drawings and render them to fit over the scans. When the designer received the scans, he deemed them unusable. I then went so far as to manually measure and photo document the underpinnings for the designer in an attempt to help him determine what he was working with around the body and buck design. With so much time and money invested into this process and realizing we had no end in sight, I decided to abandon the computerized process and go back to my traditional methods. I designed the passenger side of the car by eye, piece by piece, longitudinally laying it out. In 2 weeks, I had half of the car done and had noted the radius and shaping method on each tube. My son, who was 15 at the time, took all my notes and precisely matched my half of the car, making the driver's side. We now had an aluminum tube buck, and in my eyes, the shape was gorgeous. As you're shaping the tubes, you really get a feel of the body language. I found there were some parameters of the original design we had to stick to, one being the windshield shape, and the other the driver's and passenger door line at the window base. These two things resulted in a slightly different roof line and door line leading into both front and rear fender arch shapes. However, once I got those lines to flow with the buck, the overall shape really came to life. Another challenging area would be the upper door and window frame. Making this out of thin air and entirely out of aluminum proved to be a massive undertaking. I modified the original fender liners and rear diffuser to function with all of the new work. I now had the full tube buck built with doors, windows, and the hood all functioning. It was time to skin the car. In my previous videos, I go into detail on how I shape the panels. I've learned several new techniques since those videos were posted, and I'll be sharing those updates soon. I began shaping out the rear quarters on the car. Next up came the doors and then moved into the nose. The process can be pretty taxing as my head has to be in the moment, but I also have to stay 10 steps ahead thinking about everything from suspension movement to airflow to heat dissipation. One challenge I faced with the panel work on this build was the overall size of these panels. This car is much larger than my earlier builds. With my son still in school, I was oftentimes in the shop alone. As the panels got welded up, I found myself trying to handle all these large clips single-handedly. I hammered and dollied, and when I could, wheeled the panels to planish them out, but it was quite difficult. I oftentimes had to imagine myself back in the 50s doing this very thing and chuckled at what this story might sound like and what it looked like. If only these panels could talk, the stories they would tell. At one point, I even roped my wife into helping me wheel the roof panel out, which was quite an exercise. The two of us worked together in unison for the better part of an hour, making sure we knew exactly what the other was doing and watched the panels slowly arrive at the desired shape. I now had the tail section skinned, but I felt something just wasn't right. Funny enough, this was the same exercise Alfa Romeo went through with the original TZ2, where they added length to the tail end. I did the exact same thing, which in the end I believe gave the rear proportions a perfect balance and tightened up the overall shape of the cam tail. So the body was nearly complete, and it was time to turn my attention to the interior. One thing I've learned in coach building is that in most cases, it's very difficult to take an existing design and create something entirely new over it. This applies for both interior and exterior design work. The Viper's original interior would certainly challenge me in this area. We created custom translucent gauge faces for all of the original gauges. Can't mention all of the work that went into these gauges without mentioning my friend Jeff Langendorfer, who assisted with many of these details. We would also go as far as to remove the original HVAC controls and mill them from aluminum. Turning my attention to the steering wheel and shifter, I decided to redesign them in period fashion using the same walnut that I used in my shop. I had master boat builder Kevin Fitzke take my designs and bring them to life, finishing both in a beautiful deep varnish with the aluminum portion of the steering face being engine turned. The next challenge would be to create a gated shifter. I started by finding the parameters of each shift point and then marking them out with tape and cardboard. Shifting through all the gears, I laid out the entire pattern step by step. I then transferred that pattern onto an aluminum template. I reinstalled the aluminum template and tested it, fine-tuning the opening with the diameter of the new shifter we made. Over the course of several tests, I made a template that, again, my friend Jeff milled out for me. With only a couple of prototype samples, we were able to create the gated shifter you see here. And for those wondering about torque, twist, and movement in the drivetrain, we took that into consideration with the design, and so far it's worked flawlessly. With the goal of not disrupting the original electrical system and the BCM, I had to find a way to introduce period-style toggle switches to the control system. This was all new territory for me. All of the signal stock functions, signals, wipers, high and low beam, were stripped and rerouted. The final item to address in the electrical system would be the factory sound system. I removed the original head unit and installed a Bluetooth system from Ghostbox. I was able to retain the original door speakers and subwoofer. To be honest, I've never had a sound system in any of the Runge cars and feel the engine note should suffice. However, I was up for the challenge with the Veleno. Moving on to the carpet, leather, and stitch work. The Viper seats were stripped down. I then cut back the foam using a meat saw, slowly cutting and sanding away to shape them into something looking more reminiscent of the 1960s. During the seat modification, I was mindful that I needed to gain as much headroom as possible. I cut a total of 1.5 inches of foam down on the seat base and couldn't go any deeper. It still wasn't enough. After doing more research, I learned that the Viper has a common problem with drivers over 6 feet tall not having enough headroom. A fairly simple solution is to remove the seat sliders from the lower frame. This gained me another 1.5 inches of headroom. Thankfully, I retained the original adjustable pedal feature on the car, and the upper seat back still moves forward and back, so all in all, the car is suitable for people of various heights. The flat rear area of the cockpit would be designed as a parcel shelf. To do this, I laid foam over an aluminum panel that was cut to fit the area. I covered the entire panel in leather and then installed the hand-formed and polished slats using brazier-style aluminum rivets. Prior to giving my final touches to the door cards, I was able to drive the car around 50 miles.
First drive with the Veleno, and I am just ecstatic. I love old warbirds, and this thing sounds just like one of those old fighter planes.
This inspired my door card design, where I laid out the armrest to have the feel and look of a propeller rotating, with the center being the speaker. Yes, this is the first Runge car to have a stereo system. I often compare being this far involved in a build to being in the heart of a massive storm. It's difficult to gain perspective because you're so completely engaged. The easiest way for me to regain perspective is to zoom out, get a bird's eye view, and as I mentioned, sometimes imagine what somebody might say about this work 50 years from now. This is similar to the feeling I get when I cross the finish line. I step back and remember this is all a part of the journey. I have to look at what all of this work has taught me and consider how I can pass on what I've learned to the next generation. That's really what this is all about.